I'm Liz Neisloss. Tonight on Greater Boston, as we head into the second year of war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is digging in on Russia's aggression, while Biden pledges unwavering support for Ukraine. We'll take stock of all that's happened so far and where the war may be headed. Then, the apocalyptic outbreak behind HBO's series The Last of Us is based on a real fungus. How much did the show get right? And could any of it happen in real life? A doctor joins me with answers ahead. This week marks 1 year since Russia began its brutal assault on Ukraine. So far, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians have been killed in the war that's followed, and millions of others have been forced to flee their homes. To mark the somber anniversary, President Joe Biden made a risky surprise visit to Kyiv, meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky, and sent a warning to the Kremlin.
Russia's aim was to wipe Ukraine off the map. Putin's war of conquest is failing. 1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. And that's how long we're going to be with you, Mr. President, for as long as it takes.
We'll do it.
Biden also pledged to further escalate sanctions targeting Russia's financial and energy sectors and more military aid worth $500 million. But Russian President Vladimir Putin showed no signs of change. Instead, in his annual State of the Nation speech earlier this week, he seemed to prepare Russians for his version of as long as it takes. And he directed blame for the war to the West and the U.S.
The elite of the West do not conceal their ambitions, which is to strategically defeat Russia, finish us off once and for all.
And throwing down another gauntlet, Putin also announced that Russia will suspend its participation in the only remaining nuclear arms control treaty it's made with the U.S. So where does that leave us? And what can we expect in year two? To discuss this, I'm joined by Emily Channell-Justice, the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute, and Joshua Shifrinson, associate professor with the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. So let's start with what seem to be pretty powerful optics. Joshua, maybe you can weigh in. Pretty strong statement made by this surprise visit. Was it a world-convincing moment?
Well, in terms of whether it's a world-convincing moment, I think we've already seen the evidence of this. China, for one, has certainly not taken up on the U.S. banner. We already see reticence amongst many of the European allies in following the U.S. message with as long as it takes and an indefinite conflict supporting Ukraine against Russia. So it wasn't world-defining. It was very much supportive, though, or helpful to Biden's domestic agenda.
And Emily, these were Biden, left Kyiv and then went to Poland, made another speech. Putin made his annual address. Some people were calling them almost dueling speeches. What did you see in what you heard?
Well, I think it was important, certainly for Biden to visit Kyiv. And I think in the wake of that visit to also speak in Poland, because Poland has really led Ukraine's European allies and kind of tried to set this example, despite the fact, that they don't have the strongest economy in Europe or the largest economy or anything, but they're the closest to understanding what Ukraine is going through. And so I think that's a very significant move. The thing with Putin's speech is that, frankly, he really repeated a lot of what he's already said. It wasn't really new material. And I think that's kind of, he doesn't really have much more to say. There's not a lot more detail on his position. He's just sort of doubling down on where he already is. Whereas Biden's visit shows, that Ukraine's allies are processing what's happening. They're constantly responding to what's going on. So I think it shows a little bit more momentum on that side.
And well, Putin did throw what we would call on this side of the world political sops to the Russian people, maybe some, economic concessions. But really, do you see that he needs to worry about that domestic support for his agenda, Emily?
Well, Putin has really created this structure in which dissent is difficult, not just because the media narrative is limited, but because the possibilities for participation are also limited. One of the really big kind of turning points I would see now is whether or not Putin will have to call for further mobilization of Russian troops or people who have not yet gone to the front. The previous mobilization, the borders stayed open, so people who didn't want to fight were able to leave Russia. I don't know if he can do it like that again. And that's the thing that, if anything, and I'm not tremendously optimistic that domestic opinion will change, but if anything would turn the tide against Putin, it would be forcibly mobilizing people who already have shown that they don't have that much interest in going to the front.
Joshua, in terms of support here in the U.S., how do you think Biden did with that surprise visit? What do you think that did for support here? There's certainly weakened support from Republicans. Cracks are showing. There are even calls suggesting that maybe he should have been attending to a toxic spill in Ohio, not overseas. So really inflating what's happening domestically and pushing down the significance of Ukraine. What is your take?
Well, I think, first of all, I would be reluctant to frame this as a Democratic versus Republican issue. Back in November, the Chicago Council released a poll showing that 49% of Americans support aiding Ukraine for as long as it takes, whereas 47%, almost the same number, support bringing about an immediate peace deal, even if that means Ukraine has to give up territory. So I don't think that maps neatly into Republican versus Democratic. But I think Biden has been attempting to get ahead with this trip of any Republican or progressive Democrat opposition to continue aid to Ukraine, because I think we are nearing the limit of American and or Western tolerance for an indefinite aid spigot to Ukraine.
Well, do you think, Joshua, to continue that thought, I mean, he does need ultimately Republican support. Do you think he's still framing the message correctly on why the U.S. needs to be involved in Ukraine?
In my opinion, no. At the outset of the war, President Biden framed this as a war to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. This, frankly, by his own statements in Warsaw, this mission has been accomplished. And so in a sense, he is kind of repeating the same message as to why the U.S. has to continue aiding Ukraine, even though by his own definition, the war aims of the United States have been obtained. So there's a certain disconnect going on in President Biden's strategy, and I'm not sure this is going to be sufficient to mobilize the massive Republican and Democratic support that he'll need to continue standing by Ukraine for however long it takes.
But, Emily, isn't this really about more than just Ukraine?
Absolutely. I mean, I've said this, unfortunately, for the past year. This is really about whether or not we want to live in a world where people like Vladimir Putin call the shots. I mean, Ukraine was obviously not a perfect democracy when the invasion happened, but it had made a lot of really significant advances, especially in the past 7 or 8 years. So to me, and certainly Ukraine's claims to territorial integrity and to its own self-determination are the same as any other democracy's claims to those things. So to me, this is really about Vladimir Putin and Russia saying to Ukraine, we don't care about those things. We've decided you don't get to have those. And the rest of the world needs to decide if that's acceptable, because if it is, then, we've got to really rethink the world order that we have. Again, that world order is imperfect. I recognize that. But the aims here are about, I think, much greater concerns than, just simply, how long it will take to support Ukraine or to convince Republicans to keep supporting Ukraine.
So your colleagues collectively over at Brookings believe that, the debate has sort of been muddied, that it's been framed as, we need to weaken Russia and maybe Putin has to be overthrown and democracies should line up against autocracies. But that position is really that their position is really that, we should be talking about the territorial integrity that's been violated, and that's a pretty basic issue, and that this could happen to any number of countries. Joshua, do you think this is an argument that holds weight?
No, and in fact, I would actually push back a little bit on Emily's prior argument that this is about freedom writ large. In fact, as I said a minute ago, President Biden himself at the outset of the war made this about sovereignty, not freedom per se. So to make this about freedom is to transform the war between Russia and Ukraine into a global argument that I don't think carries much water, because we've seen many countries violate other countries' sovereignties, other freedoms, other territorial rights with very little opposition. So this is not a question of the nature of international order, nor is it a question about the inviolability of territorial boundaries. This is a contest, tragically, over whether Ukraine was to be subservient to Russia, or perhaps have Russia dominate the Ukrainian government.
But
thankfully,
the fact that though Russia makes it clear that Ukraine might not be the end of it, that's not concerning. Yes. They're, making perhaps designs on Poland, threatening vaguely Estonian towns, that kind of thing.
I should be very clear about this. It is disconcerting, excuse me, and that's exactly why President Biden's affirmation or reaffirmation that Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, of the Washington Treaty, is sacrosanct in his view, is so important. But Ukraine versus Russia it may be the tip of the iceberg, or it may just be a one-off issue. And thankfully, we have systems in place to hedge against that downside risk.
And what systems are you thinking would work in this case?
Well, in this case, we have the whole NATO alliance. In this case, we have countries like the Baltic states, like Poland, in NATO. That's that part of the logic of their seeking to join NATO back in the 90s and 2000s was their own desire to hedge against this. And part of the reason the U.S. supported their entry into NATO is to hedge against this risk. So we have a fire break in place, and I think we shouldn't pretend that it doesn't exist.
Well, it's whether or not we wish to exercise the true power of that fire break. Emily, some suggest that perhaps one way to achieve peace is to say, okay, NATO will not expand. We'll stand where we are. Would that do it?
No, because this really was never about NATO in the first place. And I, to go back to what you were just saying previously, I mean, this didn't start in February of 2022, right? This is a war that started in Ukraine in 2014, but really we should be tracing it back to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, right? This isn't just the first time that Russia has decided that, they want to have control or say over countries in this region. And so for that reason, I really don't think that any concession about NATO is going to be a so-called off-ramp for Putin to then disengage from Ukraine. Frankly, I think it would be an invitation. Of course, we haven't tried, but I mean,
so it's very hard to draw conclusions about that.
Right, except for that we know that when Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine had really no designs on joining NATO in the first place. It was not a very popular thing to even think about Ukraine's future in NATO then. So Ukraine was technically neutral. So if Ukraine commits to neutrality, what's to say that Russia won't just reinvade? That's what they did before, when Ukraine was not part of NATO or didn't have any promises to be part of NATO.
Well, except for the 2008 Bucharest summit, which did say that the alliance is committed to Ukraine joining NATO. So it's not quite right to say that there is no path for Ukraine to join NATO.
Right. And in 1994, Ukraine was also given security guarantees by Russia that they wouldn't invade its territory.
And in 1990, the Soviet Union was given assurances that NATO wouldn't expand to Eastern Europe. So there's a whole back and forth of the diplomacy here that we're kind of gliding over very rapidly and with a little bit of flippancy.
So there is one other piece that the U.S. is lobbying in. Again, it's two more pieces. They're now lobbying in more military aid and the possibility of ratcheting up sanctions. That seems so far to be a pretty useless tool. What do you say, Joshua?
It depends what sanctions are intended to do. If they were intended to bring about the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, they are absolutely useless.
They haven't had any deterrent effect.
Not at all, nor are they intended to deter. They were imposed after Russia invaded, meaning deterrence had already failed. They have not been successful in coercing Russia to leave Ukraine. If the question is, though, have they been slowing down the Russian effort, the Russian war aims, the fact that Russia has been forced to turn to countries like Iran and China suggests that there has been some impediments posed on the Russian war.
Which some would say deepens the conflict even further. Emily, you believe sanctions have any efficacy, whether to deter or to slow down?
I still have some hope that potentially they will in the future. I mean, the role of Iran and China here, I think, is really essential. Obviously, we've seen influence from both of those countries around supplying parts for Russian military equipment, which helps them continue to bombard Ukraine. We've just gotten word over the past few days that China has been also aiding Russia. So in a sense, it's obvious that there are too many loopholes in sanctions to make them be really effective. That being said, I mean, there are still things that can be done in terms of seizing Russian assets and that sort of thing. I do think it's the symbolism of so many countries uniting around the tactic of sanctions, again, is still important in terms of the greater response.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even 40 countries. Joshua, do you think that the U.S. has any further ability to sort of counter Russia's influence outside of Europe, where it has managed some success?
Counter Russian influence outside of Europe in what sense?
In terms of countering Ukraine, in terms of rallying outside of the European coalition it's managed to pull together.
Well, it's very hard because right now a lot of the countries that still do business with Russia, they have massive financial incentives to do so. China is able to gain a larger market for its goods and services at the time when China industrial potential is way too large. India has been benefiting from very cheap oil. So there are very real financial and political limits to what else the United States can do to kind of further squeeze the Russian war economy, which is a tragedy, unfortunately.
Okay. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. Emily, Joshua, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, if you're anything like me, you've been riveted by HBO's new show, The Last of Us. Based on an action-adventure video game by the same name, the series follows characters trying to survive in a post-apocalyptic United States. The cause of the apocalypse? A mass outbreak of a fungus that essentially turns infected human beings into zombies. Even those like me, who aren't exactly zombie action fans, are finding it compelling. The scariest part? It's based, at least in part, on some reality. The villain in the series, the cordyceps fungus, actually exists, though not in the way it appears in the show. That might be the monster under your bed. But where does reality end and science fiction begin? Is any of this really a problem for humanity? Joining me to sort out fact from fiction is Dr. Scott Roberts, an assistant professor and associate medical director of infection prevention at the Yale School of Medicine. Well, doctor, I guess I can't ask you what you think of the show, but how, because you haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure you will after this.
I plan to.
You plan to. How accurate is the idea that a cordyceps fungus could take over a human being? Can you weigh in on that? Because I think it really does have some people pondering.
So this is a real fungus, and what it does is it really infects certain types of ants and causes them to change behavior and have movements in a way that the fungus does what it needs to do to reproduce and spread spores. I think, fortunately for us, is that this is a very species-specific interaction with these ants. And as an example, this cordyceps species is really unable to even spread amongst other ant species. So this likely evolved over many thousands of years, and I think the risk of this jumping to humans is extremely low.
Did you actually see, there was a BBC documentary that was something of the genesis for this Planet Earth episode that called it The Attack of the Killer Fungus. It led to this idea that ants can be taken over by a fungus because their brains were being controlled. Can you weigh in on any of this? There are, of course, debates about what exactly the fungus is doing to the ant.
Yeah, it's likely not actually brain control, but once the ant dies from infection, it sort of hijacks the movements of the ant through the nervous system. And so that causes it to move to an area where it can disseminate spores. But I think the risk that this will ultimately infect humans, kill humans, and cause that behavior change is really next to none. You know, we do have fungal and mold species in the air that we breathe in every day, and very few of these actually cause infections. And the ones that do really, in very rare circumstances, cannot spread person to person.
So we have a clip because we have to actually show what the issue is here that people are seeing. This is a clip from The Last of Us, which shows a mycologist examining a patient. I think we have something we can run.
Apa ini gigitan manusia?
So, Doctor, clearly this is not. You see the problem with what's being conveyed. I think people really have this concern that it can invade the body, but there are fungal infections. There are fungi that do invade the human body. What should we really be focused on?
You know, I think the reason I'm glad for the show is it is raising awareness for fungal infection in general. And what I can say is that most fungal infection occurs either through the pulmonary system, such as a pneumonia, valley fever in the southwestern United States, or histoplasmosis or blastomyces more in our region. And these occur through inhalation of spores and really in the most extreme of cases usually causes a pneumonia. In some scenarios, and certain patient characteristics, such as those heavily immunocompromised or with indwelling devices or catheters, they can develop fungal infections that are what we term invasive. And usually this just means we find the fungus in the bloodstream or other deeper body sites. But really isolating what looks like specific debris of the fungus like they're pulling out in the show is really not how we see fungal infection present in normal human infection.
But fungal infections have been on the rise. Is that accurate? In 2021, something like 1.7 million people globally died as a result of some sort of fungal infection. So is the rise worrisome?
Absolutely. These are on the rise, and it is certainly worrisome. We're seeing fungal infections that are usually restricted to a certain area, like histoplasmosis in the Midwest, for instance. This is expanding. We're seeing this creep out into other states and other regions. And I think the other thing is we're seeing new fungal species evolve with global warming. And there's one that arose in the past 10 years that we worry about in hospital settings called Candida auris, which many think arose because of global warming, and that these fungal species are able to adapt to a warmer environment. And obviously, one reason that fungal infections don't infect humans very frequently is that our body temperatures are high, and certainly more so than cold-blooded species. And so with that, we're seeing fungal infections that may be able to adapt to infect humans with higher frequencies.
So fungal infections, fungi have not gotten the attention, not gotten, you could say, the love that viruses and bacteria have gotten, which means, I suppose, reduced resources for research. What do you think the issue is?
I think in general, these are not that prevalent. And when they are, they really don't cause severe problems. The ones that do really infect very specific patient populations that are far less numbers than that of a virus like COVID, for instance. Just today in our hospital, we've had 50 plus patients with COVID, and maybe only one or two will have an invasive fungal infection. So I think the good thing this show is raising awareness. But if you were to ask me as an infectious disease physician, what keeps me up at night? It's still going to be that next virus around the corner, whether it's a COVID variant or an avian flu, rather than fungal infections, just due to the sheer number of infections that people come down with these. However, I certainly am concerned in general with the rise in fungal infections, the new species we're seeing, and the fact that more and more people are getting infected with these over time.
And is there a concern about how we can treat these fungal infections, our ability to deal with them?
Right now, we have really great treatments for almost all types of fungal infections. There are a handful that do give me concern. One is the species I mentioned, Candida auris, which arose with climate change. There have been a few Candida auris isolates that have been fully resistant to all of our antifungal drugs. So I think the good news about the show raising awareness to this is that hopefully we can dedicate more resources toward combating this and developing new drugs if these continue to evolve.
So the WHO, for the first time, I think last year, put out a list of what it considers the top most, something like 19 most concerning fungi. Do you think that will motivate more research, more resources?
I certainly hope so. And I think the WHO and the CDC really making a point to include these on their list of emerging threats is really only going to help the cause of combating fungal infection in the future. So I'm very glad to see that.
You would think, as you pointed out, we have a pandemic that is still so worrisome. You would think that people would not want to escape into more epidemic fiction when we have, this kind of pandemic reality. Why do you think people are drawn to this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the producers of this show really took a unique part of nature that's been highlighted by Planet Earth and really expanded upon it and have created this incredible show. And perhaps it's just the pandemic really impacting us, but it seems that audience is ripe for apocalyptical shows. And I think that this is really seizing the moment right now. And, I certainly am very eager for this pandemic to end. I know others are as well. And however, I've heard the show is great, and I plan to watch it as soon as I'm able.
Okay, and you have any advice for people about who are concerned about different fungi?
I think in general the risk to the average patient is low, but really doing what people can to really ensure healthy practices that reduce the risk for fungal infections. So really a healthy lifestyle, preventing diabetes, really controlling a lot of comorbidities that put patients at risk in the hospital where they might need catheters or immunosuppression, which predisposes people to fungal infection. But in general, the risk is low. And I certainly don't want to emphasize that this show is a potential realistic take of what could happen with a fungal infection, although we do see fungal infections in different ways in patients on a daily basis here in our hospital.
Okay. Dr. Roberts, thank you for joining us.
All right, take care.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Liz Neisloss. Thanks for watching, and good night.
GBH's signal spans